For almost half a century, Iran and Israel kept their hostility largely behind the scenes, but the source says that changed dramatically in April 2024. It describes an Israeli strike on Iran's consular building in Damascus that killed 7 members of the Revolutionary Guard. Iran answered by sending more than 300 drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles toward military facilities in Israel. The exchange pushed a long-running rivalry into the open and turned Iran's military reach into the immediate question at the center of the story. The source also notes the irony that Israel, after often ignoring United Nations criticism, went to the Security Council and called for condemnation of Iran's attack. For decades, Iran has been described in the source as one of the states Israel fears most, and as a powerful adversary of the United States. So the question is not simply what Iran launched in 2024, but how this country became influential enough to be treated as such a serious regional threat. To answer that question, the story has to move backward across thousands of years, long before the Islamic Republic existed. It has to return into the civilizations, kingdoms, invasions, reforms, revolutions, and wars that repeatedly reshaped the Iranian plateau. That long history is the path the source uses to explain the modern Iran that stands at the center of Middle Eastern geopolitics today. Iran's official modern name is the Islamic Republic of Iran, while the older name Persia still carries enormous historical weight in the Western world. The source presents the Iranian plateau as home to one of humanity's oldest major civilizations and traces human activity there back into prehistory. It mentions archaeological remains associated with Neanderthals that are described as roughly 100,000 years old. Southwestern Iran also formed part of the Fertile Crescent, the broad region where some of humanity's earliest food crops were cultivated. The Persians themselves arrived later, during the Iron Age, after other peoples had already built societies across the plateau. Among the earliest communities described by the source were the people of Susa, who were present thousands of years before the Common Era. Susa developed into the civilization known as Elam, one of the great early powers of the region. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded, Elam lost territory, and many of its people were driven away or absorbed into populations moving onto the Iranian plateau. Those populations included the Medes, Persians, Parthians, Urartians, and other groups linked by the source to migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. For a time, many of them lived under Assyrian domination. In 646 BCE, the source says the remaining Elamite power was crushed by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, forcing survivors to seek refuge elsewhere. But constant Assyrian pressure also encouraged smaller peoples in western Iran to unite into larger and more centralized states. By the 7th century BCE, the Medes had secured independence from Assyria. They then allied with Babylonian forces, besieged the Assyrian capital, and helped bring the Neo-Assyrian Empire to an end. The source credits the Medes with an important role in building the first Iranian imperial state. From this environment rose Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Silken, who joined Median and Persian power into an empire that expanded far beyond its original homeland. The source portrays Cyrus as a ruler whose relatively tolerant policies helped win obedience across a diverse population and gave the Persian state unusual durability. His son Cambyses too continued the expansion by conquering ancient Egypt and ending its 26th dynasty. Cambyses died while leaving Egypt, and the source repeats an ancient account from Herodotus that connected his death with the anger of Egyptian gods. After a brief struggle over succession, Darius I took power and presented himself as a legitimate heir of the Achaemenid royal line. Rebellions broke out when Darius rose to the throne, but he suppressed them and strengthened imperial administration. The imperial capital moved to Susa, while Darius also built Persepolis as another monumental center of Persian rule. The source says he constructed a canal linking the Nile with the Red Sea and treats it as an early predecessor of the later Suez Road. His reign also left royal inscriptions in Old Persian, written with a specially adapted cuneiform script. Under Cyrus and especially Darius, the Persian Empire became, in the sources telling, the largest empire humanity had yet seen. Its territories stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa, making Persia the first great superpower in the source's historical arc. Its government is described as holding together many peoples through law, tolerance, and respect for different cultures and religions. Yet by the end of the 6th century BCE, Darius was turning Persian power toward new wars in Europe. Darius moved against territories beyond his European frontier, and Persian forces brought several coastal Greek communities under imperial control. When Athens intervened, the confrontation widened into the Greco-Persian Wars, which the source describes as one of the defining conflicts of ancient European history. Persia regained control over Thrace and Macedonia, but it also suffered major defeats. Darius's successor, Xerxes I, launched a second invasion and temporarily occupied large parts of mainland Greece. Greek victories eventually forced Persian armies back, and the long conflict ended with the Peace of Calais in 449 BCE. Decades later, after the death of Darius II, Egypt rebelled and resisted repeated Persian efforts to reconquer. Persian control was finally restored under Artaxerxes III, but the empire was approaching an even greater challenge. In the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great defeated Darius III in a series of battles and ended Achaemenid rule. Greek and Macedonian power then dominated Iran, but Alexander's empire fragmented after his death. One of his generals, Seleucus Nicator, established the Seleucid Empire across Iran, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. Seleucid power lasted roughly a century before it was pushed out of Iran by the Parthian Empire, founded by the Arsacid dynasty. The Parthians expanded from the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia into eastern Arabia and became Rome's principal rival in the east. Their cavalry combined heavily armored horsemen with fast mounted archers, a style of warfare the source presents as especially dangerous to Roman infantry. Yet Parthian armies were less effective at prolonged sieges, which made holding conquered cities more difficult. Even so, Parthian rule endured for about 5 centuries. It finally gave way to another Persian dynasty, the Sasanians, who launched a major internal renewal of the economy and military. Under Ardashir I and his successors, Iran again became one of the most powerful states in the world. For more than 4 centuries, Sasanian Persia competed with the Roman, and later, Byzantine empires. The source describes Sasanian territory at its height as reaching across Iran, Iraq, the Caucasus, parts of the Levant, Afghanistan, Turkey, Pakistan, Central Asia, Eastern Arabia, and portions of Egypt. War with Rome and Byzantium repeatedly swept through Anatolia, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Levant. After centuries of conflict, the Roman-Persian struggle finally subsided, leaving the Sasanians as the last great empire of pre-Islamic Iran. But the long wars had exhausted Persia, just as a new force was rising from Arabia. Muslim armies entered Sasanian territory and fought the decisive Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in the region that is now Iraq. The source links the conquest to the expansion led during the Caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab, after internal conflict in Arabia had ended. The Muslim conquest destroyed the Sasanian state and greatly weakened the old Zoroastrian religious order. Most Iranians gradually became Muslim, while many elements of earlier Persian civilization survived inside the new Islamic political world. The source emphasizes that Iranians have remembered this transformation in very different ways. Some view it as the arrival of the true faith, while others see it as a humiliating defeat and foreign conquest. When Abbasid authority later weakened, Turkish dynasties from Central Asia increasingly controlled Persian lands and took over parts of the Caliphate's administration. The fall of effective Abbasid control opened the next stage of fragmentation across Iran. As Abbasid power receded, smaller governments appeared across Iran, including the Tahirids in Khorasan, the Safavids in Sistan, and the Samanids centered on Bukhara. In 962, Alp-Taygin, a former Samanid military slave commander, seized Ghazna and established the foundation of Ghaznavid rule. Later Turkic forces, especially Seljuk Oghuz groups from around the Amu Darya, conquered Persia. The source says Persian culture and scholarship experienced a revival under Seljuk rulers such as Tughril and Malik Shah. After Malik Shah's death, political unity fractured again, and Iran broke into smaller states. That division continued until the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan entered Persia with consequences far more destructive than the earlier Turkic conquests. Cities were devastated, large numbers of people were killed, and irrigation systems were ruined. The destruction changed settlement patterns and, in the source's account, caused a severe decline in population. Mongol rule brought only limited recovery at first. A more serious restoration came under Ghazan Khan and his advisor Rashid al-Din, who lowered taxes, encouraged agriculture, repaired irrigation, and expanded trade with India and China. After Ghazan and later Abu Sa'id died, Iran fragmented once more. Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror, then invaded Persia and inflicted new destruction on cities such as Isfahan and Shiraz. His empire also broke apart after his death, while Mongol and Turkmen influence continued under later rulers. Eventually the Safavids rose and brought most of Iran and surrounding territories under a new centralized dynasty. The source treats the Safavid state as one of the major foundations of modern Iranian national identity. Beginning in the early 16th century, Safavid rule transformed Iran by establishing Twelver Shi'ism as the empire's official religion. That decision became one of the most important turning points in Iranian Islamic history. The Safavid state also became one of the major Islamic gunpowder empires, developing a powerful military and competing with the Ottoman and Mughal empires. After Safavid rule collapsed, Iran passed through the Afsharid, Zand, and Qajar dynasties. European powers began exerting stronger influence from the 17th century onward, and Iran gradually lost territory. By the 19th century, constitutional reform introduced a new political structure without completely removing the monarchy. The Constitutional Revolution created the Majlis, a parliament formally established on October 7, 1906. Soon afterward, the discovery of oil in Khuzestan intensified British and Russian competition for influence inside Iran. The source depicts the Qajar government as weak, while those outside powers struggled for access to Iranian oil and political leverage. Out of that instability rose Reza Pahlavi, who challenged the existing order, became Shah, and founded a new dynasty. Before becoming Shah, Reza Pahlavi had built a reputation as a capable war minister who commanded respect inside the military. The source describes the young Qajar ruler Ahmad Shah as unable to control a government weakened by disorder and corruption. Public pressure elevated Reza first to the premiership, and then, in 1925, to the throne. Reza Shah built an authoritarian state shaped by nationalism, militarism, secularism, anti-communism, censorship, and official propaganda. At the same time, he reorganized the armed forces, government administration, public finance, and major parts of social and economic life. Schools, railways, buses, radio, cinemas, telephones, and other modern infrastructure expanded during his nearly 16 years of rule. For supporters, those changes made Reza Shah a national modernizer. For critics described by the source, modernization moved too quickly and concealed repression, corruption, heavy taxation, and the methods of a police state. New rules also angered religious communities and clerics. Men were pushed toward Western-style clothing, women were encouraged to remove the hijab, and mixed social life became more acceptable under official policy. Tensions exploded in 1935 at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, where protesters denounced the Shah and compared him to Yazid. Government forces suppressed the uprising, leaving dozens dead and hundreds wounded according to the source. Iran had already lived under strong British and Russian pressure, even while officially trying to remain neutral in the era of the First World War. Oil made the country strategically important to the Allied powers. When the Second World War began, Allied governments demanded that Reza Shah remove German nationals from Iran. He refused, and British and Soviet forces invaded the country. Reza Shah was forced from power and replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The source portrays the younger Shah as far more dependent on Britain and increasingly unpopular inside Iran. Over time, political anger under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi fed the movement that became the Iranian, or Islamic, Revolution. The revolution transformed Iran from an absolute monarchy into an Islamic republic, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Large demonstrations began in January 1978 and continued through strikes, unrest, and political paralysis. In January 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran for exile. On February 1st, Khomeini returned to the country and was greeted by millions of supporters. A referendum then approved the creation of the Islamic Republic, which was formally declared on April 1st, 1979. A new theocratic constitution established Khomeini as the country's supreme leader and ended the Pahlavi monarchy that had ruled since 1925. The new Islamic Republic reorganized political authority around an explicitly Islamic and predominantly Shiite ideology. Its constitution was based on the concept of vilayat-e-faqih, the idea that society required guidance and supervision from qualified Islamic jurists. Khomeini served as supreme leader under that system until his death in 1989. The source says the new government replaced much of the previous capitalist model with policies presented as more Islamic and more favorable to ordinary people. Major industries were nationalized, schools and laws were Islamized, and Western cultural influence was restricted. Iran also broke its previous cooperation with Israel. Inside the country, the government rebuilt state institutions and military capacity after the disruption of the revolution. From 1982 to 1983, it suppressed challenges from secular groups, left-wing movements, and more traditional Muslim opponents. Many political enemies were executed during that consolidation. Armed revolts also erupted in Khuzestan, Kurdistan, and Gonbad-e-Kabustoti. The Kurdish uprising, led by the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, became one of the bloodiest and lasted until 1983, with the source giving a death toll of about 10,000. Another early crisis had consequences far beyond Iran's borders. After the former Shah was admitted to the United States for cancer treatment, Iranian students seized the American embassy on November 4, 1979. They described the embassy as a nest of spies and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. A United States military rescue attempt failed, and the captives were not released until January 1981. The hostage-taking was highly popular among many supporters of the revolution and strengthened Khomeini's anti-American political base. Khomeini called the United States the Great Satan, while Americans viewed the seizure of diplomats as a fundamental violation of international rules. The crisis created a powerful anti-Iranian backlash in the United States. The source connects that rupture with a long-period hostility and sanctions that placed heavy pressure on Iran's economy. The same revolutionary turmoil also exposed military weakness that Saddam Hussein believed Iraq could exploit. Before the revolution, Iran's armed forces had been regarded as formidable, but internal conflict and the fall of the Shah badly disrupted them. Saddam Hussein wanted to become the dominant strongman of the region and expand Iraq's access to the Persian Gulf. He was especially interested in Khuzestan, a province with a substantial Arab population and rich oil fields. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces launched a large invasion of Iran and opened the Iran-Iraq War. The attack surprised Khomeini's government while the country was still dealing with revolutionary upheaval. Iraq initially held the advantage, but Iranian forces eventually drove Iraqi troops back toward their own border by 1982. At that point, Khomeini considered carrying the Islamic Revolution into Iraq, especially among Iraq's Shiite Arab majority. Instead of ending, the war continued for roughly 6 more years. A United Nations brokered ceasefire finally ended the fighting in 1988. The source describes the war as catastrophic for both countries and says Iraq used chemical weapons during the conflict. It estimates Iranian losses at between 500,000 and 1 million military and civilian deaths. Iraq received financial or military support from Egypt, Arab Gulf states, the Soviet Union, and Warsaw Pact countries, the United States, France, Germany, Britain, Brazil, and China. China, the source notes, also sold weapons to Iran. International representatives later confirmed Iraq's use of chemical weapons, while the source says Iran did not use chemical weapons during the war. After the ceasefire with Iraq, the Iranian government turned its attention inward and began executing large numbers of political prisoners. The source identifies July 19, 1988, as the beginning of what became known as the 1988 Iranian prison massacres. Members of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran were the main targets, along with smaller numbers of left-wing prisoners including members of the Tudeh party. Estimates cited by the source range from about 1,400 to as many as 30,000 people killed. Iran nevertheless appeared more stable by the final period of Khomeini's leadership. Before his death in 1989, Khomeini appointed a 25-member council to revise the constitution. Ali Khamenei, who was then president, became the next supreme leader as constitutional changes were adopted. The transfer of power was relatively smooth, and Khomeini was supported by important elements of the armed forces and economically powerful charitable foundations. The source says the political system under him increasingly resembled a clerical oligarchy. Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani succeeded Khamenei in the presidency and served 2 terms. Rafsanjani focused on rebuilding an economy and infrastructure badly damaged by 8 years of war. Low world oil prices made that task harder because oil remained Iran's largest source of state revenue. His government pursued birth control, reduced military spending, and normalized relations with neighboring states including Saudi Arabia. During the 1991 Persian Gulf War, Iran remained neutral in an effort to protect its own stability. Rafsanjani also limited some anti-American rhetoric and allowed Iraqi aircraft and refugees to enter Iranian territory during the conflicts. That quieter period gave way to renewed political tension after reformist Mohammad Khatami became president in 1997. His reform agenda collided with increasingly conservative clerical institutions. In July 1999, anti-government protests erupted in Tehran and continued for about a week before police and pro-government civilians broke them up. Khatami was re-elected in June 2001, but conservative forces in parliament and other institutions increasingly blocked his reforms. Liberal newspapers were closed, and reformist parliamentary candidates were disqualified from running. The source says those restrictions helped produce political apathy among younger Iranians. Yet, internal tension did not erase Iran's regional power. The source describes Iran as a major actor in Middle Eastern conflicts, including those in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. It connects that influence with a much older history in which Persian states had repeatedly dominated broad parts of the region. The source also cites a global firepower ranking that placed Iran 14th among 145 states for military strength. It attributes that position to manpower, finances, logistics, geography, and sustained military spending. Iran's armed forces are described as including about 580,000 active personnel and another 200,000 trained reservists. Those forces are divided between the regular military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran is also described as possessing one of the Middle East's largest stocks of ballistic missiles and drones. Its arsenal includes cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, and ballistic missiles with ranges up to 2,000 kilometers. The source says those weapons can reach targets across the Middle East, including Israel. It also says Iranian-made weapons have been sold to Russia for use in the war in Ukraine. International sanctions, in the source's view, have limited Iran's ability to build an even larger military. At the same time, Iran has consistently rejected foreign, especially Western, military and political intervention in its own affairs and across the region. That position became especially pronounced after the 1979 revolution and is often directed at United States involvement in the Middle East. The source also acknowledges that Iran itself intervenes indirectly in neighboring conflicts by supporting allied groups, including Shiite organizations in Iraq et al. This brings the history back to Israel. Iran and Israel had been partners during the pro-Western rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the source says Iran was the second country after Egypt to recognize Israel. After the Islamic Revolution, that relationship was replaced by open ideological hostility. Iranian leaders portrayed Israel as an occupying power responsible for Palestinian suffering and called it the Little Satan, while the United States became the Great Satan. The source says Iran had generally avoided direct attacks on Israel, even while supporting a regional axis of resistance operating through armed groups in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. In that framing, the April 2024 Iranian attack was retaliation for the strike on its diplomatic facility in Damascus rather than direct intervention in the Palestinian war. The confrontation therefore closes the circle opened at the beginning of the documentary. Modern Iran emerges from the source not as a state created in 1979, but as the latest political form of a society repeatedly transformed by empire, conquest, religion, foreign pressure, revolution, and war. And with Iran and Israel now confronting each other more directly, the source ends with warnings that the rivalry could still widen into a far larger regional conflict.